Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture on historical and conceptual overview of development communication. This lecture is a part of your paper on development communication. As the title suggests, this module will give you an insight about the historical and conceptual framework about development communication. The concept of development communication has been in existence since a long time, but till 1960s its importance in the political, socio-economic and cultural development has not been recognized. Development communication that started taking shape in the second half of the 20th century evolved as a separate branch of communication. Unlike the developed countries, the interest in the process of development by the developing countries was taken much later. So before we proceed to understand the historical and conceptual outline of development, let us have a brief recall of what is meant by it. A number of definitions of development communication are in circulation by communication scholars and sociologists. Development communication is the communication that involves human and social concerns. The genesis of the term was appropriate for describing the scopes, structures and directions of development in any nation. The broader perspective of development communication includes not only agriculture communication but every sphere of human development like health, education, employment, etc. From the definition, we can gather that development communication basically has transforming role and it looks for a positive change through innovations. Historical overview of development communication. In the context of development, especially in a developing nation, communication attempts not only to inform and aware the masses but also to persuade people for enhanced public participation in the change process. So, a widespread understanding of development from a historical framework is essential. The role of communication in the development process was acknowledged by experts and social scientists long back. In his famous treatise, The Passing of the Traditional Society by Lerner in 1958, recognized the role of communication in the development process and that the evolution of mass media had been one of the three phases of democratic and political progress. Mass media has a significant role to play in the process of development. We are already aware of the way with which mass media had led directly to socio-economic and cultural improvements across the developing nations of the world. In this context, Schramm in 1964 made an observation stating that mass media offers the vast scopes of new approaches of transforming and uplifting the lives of the deprived people. In other words, this phenomena of information dissemination is termed as development communication by scholars. With time, developing nations, especially the third world nations, started recognizing the positive roles of mass media in development. As is comprehended generally, mass media has always been prioritized for its role in diffusion of information for bringing social change. Now, if we try to find instances of the development communication in a developing country like India, then we can cite the case studies of information dissemination through radio in remote areas yielding positive results. A further look in the historical perspective precisely elaborates that mass media had potential of creating scopes of empathy among the developed nations. The simplistic definition of development communication talks about the significant role of information diffusion in accelerating the process of progress. Precisely, the treatise by Lerner, which we mentioned in the previous paragraph, also elaborately discusses the influences of mass media in the larger society. Although it is generally apprehended, but the impacts of mass media basically include an increase in the knowledge and awareness fostering human development. So in simpler words, the theory of development communication is basically an amalgamation of information, communication and education that enhances the implementation of development strategies. Social science scholars also added the element of motivation to this theory. Since the mid-1960s, there had been appeals of including communication into development strategies. The MacBride Commission report in 1980 responded to plea categorically finalizing calls to every nation to incorporate communication into the development plans and policies. Since then, a lot has been established and interpreted about the relationships between mass media and its role in development. Back in the 1960s, Schramm classified the exposition of this relationship into 12 different areas where mass media can actually play the influential role. These 12 classifications are: generating a climate for development, concentrating complete attention on development relevant issues, encouraging all types of education and substantial training skills, extending scopes of public policy dialogues, providing scopes for interpersonal channels of communication, raising motivations and aspirations, implementing social norms, building stronger collective attitudes towards progress, conferring a sense of status, building good taste, helping and change the strong negative attitudes or values that are not favorable to development, broadening possibilities of thinking. So these classifications strongly construct the idea of development that it is about the overall well-being of individuals. The power of communication in the process of development was acknowledged not only by researchers of the communications field but also by pioneers of other disciplines. For instance, while explaining the role of communication in the field of political science, the experts termed it as an indispensable component of political integration. One of the major aspects of development is political development, and it specifically means diffusion of cultures and adaptation to the new demands of society. Such diffusions can be achieved only by bridging gaps through proper communication at all levels. For attaining successful political democracy in a developing world, communication is the basic precondition, as it is the only correlate between the socio-economic and political growth. What we need to understand here is how much effort had been made on studying the effect of communication on the variables of development such as literacy, health, employment, attitude, etc. These variables are logically linked to one another. For attaining full-fledged development, the role of the recipient communities was found to be equally relevant as that of communication. Further historical analysis also indicates that role of communication in development has been changed and redefined along the emergence of paradigmatic circumstances. The old paradigm of development was unilinear. where it assumed that communicating to the elite and educated class was the only motivation that was required for ensuring the benefits of communication in the long run. It basically supported the trickle-down theory that presumed inevitable benefits out of the responses of the well-to-do elite and highly placed class of the society would trickle down to underprivileged masses. However, this approach failed to bring in positive developments in the lives of the marginalized people of developing nations. This paradigm inevitably failed to identify the actual socio-cultural and economic circumstances on which the mass media were expected to work. Moreover, it also did not take into consideration the feedbacks of the audiences. All these reasons were collectively cited for its failure. During the 1960s, the researchers in the field of development communication outlined economic growth as the final goal of development communication, and thus emerged the concept of dominant development paradigm. It was established on grounds of increased economic growth, and interestingly, all efforts were made towards using communication in achieving this goal in developing countries. In the 1970s, developing nations were found to be left out of the benefits of the worldwide industrial revolution. Rather, it was observed that the capital concentrated industrializations were causing increased migration from rural to urban areas, posing more problems and dependency. Further, the economy-driven industrialization approach was also found to be a threat to the indigenous culture. Thus, the simplistic unilinear approach of the development communication failed to support development programs. But the positive side of this failure was that the focus of development shifted from merely economic growth to other human resources. It was consciously realized by the social science scholars that the perspective of development had to be measured according to the needs of every single nation. The requirement and problems of the third world developing nations were far different from that of developed ones. So what we understand from the discussions is that development needs of any country changes according to its socio-cultural, historical, climatic and physical resources. Now, some scholars opine that the slow conscious attention to the independent variables of development would lead towards some new approaches of development communication. Such rethinking had its share of setbacks too. For instance, it was soon realized that for the effective use of communication tools and technologies in a society, sufficient knowledge about availability and accessibility of infrastructure was needed. It also helped in having a holistic understanding of the prevalent communication environment and structure. It also advocated the concept of ethno-communication, which literally means the study of available communication tools and structure within a community. Here in this context, Rogers 1976 noted that the weaknesses in the socio-structural variables and the excessive dependency on individuals as analysis units. This led to experts in demanding of a concrete policy-oriented research exploring new dimensions in the field of development communication. With the changing approaches of the development theories, different paradigms emerged with specific geographical, ideological and cultural contexts. In developing nations, mass media played an important role in the process of development, where there is a rich tradition of indigenous folk culture and knowledge. Communication is significant as it not only balances the society in terms of economy and political power, but also largely makes the masses aware about their own environment. Conceptual overview of development communication. The conceptual framework about development communication will help in understanding the main ideas that make it different from general communication. What is contradictory here is that communication is done for development, then why are we arguing here that this framework would give us an idea how does development communication can be referred as different? Development communication is essentially purposive and realistic. It was in the 1970s that new roles and positive values were attached to development communication, and thus it demanded for a redefinition. The concept of development communication became target-oriented and inspires people towards a social change. A new paradigm in the context of development molded specifically towards social justice and equity in the society. The new emerging concepts of this changed paradigm of development communication were broadly communication, development and development support communication. In the beginning, these three major concepts were briefly defined as communication, sharing of information between individuals or groups through technical channels or mediums. Development, improved and better quality of life of every citizen. Development, support communication. It implies the methodical usage of communication for development goals. Communication is a very powerful tool, but we cannot simply say that if with increased communication there will be increased scopes of development. For the planning and implement of development, a systematic communication approach needs to be followed. Development communication intends to provide opportunities for a higher quality of life in the larger society by social and positive economic political change. Though it needs to be clarified that the goal of development communication should not be viewed purely in terms of financial growth, as it also induces social, cultural, political and ethical values. And all these contributes to the well-being of a person by making him exploit his full potential. Two types of audiences form the audiences of development communication. Firstly, the communicators who send the messages, and it might include bureaucracy, media professionals and experts. And secondly, those who are at the receiving end, as the people who can be informed or uninformed. This indicates the importance of mass media in the development process. Development communication is viewed as an inseparable part of culture and other aspects of social change. Interestingly, there are other opinions as well regarding the concept of development communication. For instance, social science scholars view development communication as an organizational delivery mechanism. What we can understand from these views is that the key concepts on development, empowerment, communication and development supportive communication are based on certain assumptions and paradigms. The above definitions centrally capture the key concepts and issues of development communication. But what is to be thought here is that whether these concepts are operative enough. Are these definitions able to provide a central framework for having an in-depth understanding of the applicability of development communication? Considering the scenario of developing nations, a much realistic and practical approach of development paradigm is needed for overall growth. So, with all these issues in mind, experts try to restructure the concepts for having a clear framework of development communication. The perspective and views on development changed from time to time in line with the emerging paradigms. During the Industrial Revolution period, the holistic perspective drew the world focus to what development meant to the developing nations. So, from this viewpoint, the sole objective of development was identified as a change in the larger society that would empower the individuals to take control over their own lives and decisions. This concept basically aimed towards a society that would uphold human values. Further, Rogers in 1976 redefined development as a broadly participatory way of social change as well as material advancement for fulfilling the needs of the larger population. What we understand from these definitions is that development is a multi-dimensional concept, and this is one of the reasons that it has different meaning for different disciplines. There are different angles of perceiving development, and interestingly, all are intertwined. We observed earlier that researchers of other disciplines have accepted the power of communication in development. Now let us see how the different disciplines define development. On defining the concept, sociologists lay emphasis on the differentiation of modern societies, whereas psychologists define this concept on the basis of variable that enhances personality like self-dependency, self-confidence, self-worth, etc. Communication experts define development as the ability to acquire more knowledge and skills, and political scientists view development as the capacity to increase political awareness and facilitate political change and situation. Though all the definitions differ, but the basic point of development is somewhat same in all disciplines, and it aims towards the betterment of society, its environment, enhanced abilities of people to understand, and overall improving the existing living conditions. If we observe the definitions carefully, then we can realize that all of them make the concept of development normative that visualizes a change in the existing living conditions for better. It is not only about the development in technologies, but significantly it is the expansion of knowledge and abilities contributing to the human conscience. Communication, as we have known earlier, is the transmission of messages and ideas. What we understand is that it is not merely the transfer of facts and figure, it is basically an ongoing interactive process. In this process of communication, there is no fixed sender or receiver. It is dynamic and it keeps on changing. This process of communication indicates freedom of expression and equality. Some scholars have identified communication as a process of diffusion of way of thinking and behaving, and this is identified as classical mechanistic vertical model. Unlike the old paradigms, this classical model supports the element of feedback in communication for better persuasion, yet there is a contradiction. This model chiefly supports the role of the communicator and gives submissive role to the respondent. So, in a way, it is a one-way model of communication which emphasizes on the effect of messages on the people or how messages use people. However, the idea of persuasion is dismissed in the humanized, democratic, interactive model that underlines the idea how the people are using the messages. It basically emphasizes free, proportionate and genuine dialogue that produce mutual influence. Here in this model, understanding is considered as the critical factor of communication process. It was inducing the idea and relevance of audience's feedback because for initiating development, it became vital to understand the reality from the receiver's viewpoint. From the above discussion, what we get is that development communication is briefly the effective application of communication models for instigating development in a society. Development communication is mainly oriented towards human development. So, be it economic or social growth, as long as it supports and improves human conditions, it is considered significant. If we put it in other way, then development communication means the proper use of principles and exchange of ideas for attaining the desired development objectives. The theoretical framework also gives an idea about the socialization concept of development communication. It attempts to sustain the values and principles of any society that are consistent with process of transformation and development. As development communication is not only confined to rural areas, participation of every segment of a nation is required. In this module, we learned that development is a normative concept assuming advancements in the existing socio-economic conditions beneficial for human dignity. Development communication has tremendous scope of reaching out to the masses and creating awareness with systematic communication inputs and planning. From the conceptual framework, we understood that with changing roles and emerging paradigms, a restructuring of the concepts of development occurred. Development communication can accelerate transformation in a nation in terms of economy. It also provides prospects of greater social and economic independence by fulfillment of human potentials. We learned that the experts in communication and development fields have long accepted the role of mass media, and at the same time they have emphasized on the power of communication in development process. Both the historical and conceptual outlooks of development communication suggest that it is basically an interwoven concept having deep relevance in every other discipline. Socio-cultural, economics and political institutions of any community largely influence the role of communication. Development communication is not only the transmission of problem-solving information, but it is about how situation can be made better for human beings with the available resources and services. Conclusively, we can say that substantial research on the role of communication in development is essential in developing countries that are trying to achieve empowerment with limited sources. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of each module. Thank you.